Hello. Hi, Susanna. Hi, Francis. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. I think we're going to give it a couple more minutes to allow more people to join, and we'll then kick off from there. Okay, I think given the time, we can start, and I will hand it over to Niyati to give the introductions and welcome to the webinar. And yeah, Niyati, I'm not sure if you wanna take over from here.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. And hello, everyone. Greetings from the CGIAR Gender Platform and Shared Planet. We welcome you all today to this webinar on researching applications of geospatial approaches for gender research in agri-food systems. I'm Niyati Singaraju, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow. I work with the CGIAR Gender Impact Platform with the evidence module, and I'm based in India. So, just a brief introduction about the work we do at the CGIAR Gender Impact Platform and the topic for today's discussion. So, the Gender Platform is a CGIAR Impact platform that synthesizes and amplifies research, fills gap, and builds capacity to set directions to enable CGIAR to maximum impact on gender equality and opportunities for youth and social inclusion in agriculture and food systems. So we work in three interlinking modules, which are like research modules, one which is on evidence, methods, and alliance. So the International Rice Research Institute leads the evidence module. And as part of the evidence module, we focus on generating, synthesizing, and sharing robust evidence and identifying the emergent gaps and closing data gaps in the area of gender in agri-food systems. As you're all aware that advancing gender equality is pivotal to the transformation of food systems, as women play a very critical role in agri-food systems. However, we all are aware that women have unequal access to opportunities and resources in agri-food systems, which often puts them in vulnerable position. So a spatial dimension to understanding these complexities and the challenges women face can add a very new dimension to generating actionable insights to make policies and interventions more gender responsive. With this approach, we thought already there is a lot of research on the application of GIS in precision farming and on different aspects. However, very less is known in the sense systematically known about the use of geospatial approaches for gender research in agri-food system. Given this gap, we, along with Shared Planet, are collaborating on this study to understand, to map the current landscape of geospatial approaches and analysis applied to gender and social science research in agri-food systems and identify some of the key opportunities for future research and development. With this, I would like to pass it on to Ariel from Shared Planet, who is the lead researcher for this study and who will be taking forward for the proceedings of today's webinar. Thank you, Ariel, and welcome all, and look forward to the great discussions today.
Thank you so much, Niyati, and welcome everyone. Before we get started with the presentation of our research, I wanted to share that we will be sharing a tool called Padlet in the chat. And the goal of this presentation is our preliminary findings of our research, and we want to ensure that we are able to get your feedback, your reactions, in order for us to integrate it into the final report. And to do so, we would love to use the Padlet tool, which allows you to put in the insights. So someone from my team will be putting the link into the chat. And if you want to then use that tool throughout the webinar. And then if you do have any questions, we will have two separate Q&As. One will be with the panelists that we do have and we're lucky to have today. And then we'll move into a broader discussion where anyone can ask about the research. So with that introduction, I will hand it over to my colleague, Sophie, who will introduce our research and the team.
Thanks, Ariel. Yes, hi, everyone. I'm Sophie Legros, and I'm here today with my colleagues from Shared Planets, Ariel, Seaway, and Martina. Shared Planet is a research-led and stakeholder engagement consultancy. We're a women-led company, and we work predominantly with civil society organizations, NGOs, academic institutions, and governments to support projects that are focused on social and environmental issues. We have several practice areas, including around nature protection and restoration, just transitions, humanitarian action, digital resilience, and sustainable food systems and nutrition. And gender and social justice is a cross-cutting theme for all of our work. So if we could go to the next slide. I'm going to briefly present the research objectives and methodology of the scoping review, which focuses on the application of geospatial approaches for gender and social research in agri-food systems. So next slide, if possible. Thank you. So the project aimed to first understand how geospatial analysis can be better utilized for evidence-based policymaking related to gender and agri-food systems, And secondly, to also identify possibilities for interdisciplinary collaborations in this emerging field, which is why we're also very happy for all of you to join us in this webinar today. And the guiding question for the research was to explore what is the current state of research and opportunities of applying geospatial methods for gender research related to agri-food system, adopting a critical feminist lens. And in terms of methodologies, we conducted a comprehensive literature search, screening, and review of 120 studies that applied geospatial methods in different ways to topics at the intersection of gender, rural development, agriculture, and climate change. And then we also focused for an in-depth analysis on 75 studies that related to gender and agri-food systems and agricultural settings more specifically. But we also conducted a mapping of stakeholders, institutions, private organizations, and projects that use GIS methods for these broad topics. And we conducted 6 key informant interviews with various experts to validate our findings, also to gather insights into the processes, challenges, and opportunities of applying GIS methods in various settings, which include research, policymaking, and development interventions, and also to identify opportunities for future projects and collaborations for CGIAR, which is also, again, where this webinar comes in. And so with this background in mind, I'll hand it over to my colleagues to discuss the key findings for the research.
So we conducted a series, a literature review, and we found out different GIS applications. First of all, I'd like to start with a brief introduction and definition of what GIS are. These include a wide range of tools and techniques for capturing, storing, integrating, analyzing, and displaying data which are spatially referenced to the Earth. In most of the literature on gender and agri-food systems that we analyzed through this scopic review, we observed that GIS were used in combination with other methodologies, including remote sensing, GPS data, secondary quantitative data from nationally representative household or census surveys, and the primary qualitative data gathered through interviews, focus groups, and ethnographic research. We identified 3 main categories of GIS applications. Firstly, descriptive applications include data gathering and management, where GIS are used as a standalone or in combination with other methods to collect, manage, and store primary georeference data. The use of GIS as a visualization tool to create digital maps and dashboards, which show graphically spatial patterns within data, using GIS to track the spatial and temporal evolution of known statistical correlations or evaluate the impact of different projects. And finally, the use of GIS to create socioeconomic indicators. An example of this type of application that we'll learn about through our interview with Maria Jose Molina is the Women's Geospatial Technologies Rally. This is an initiative aimed at empowering women's farmers living in rural areas in Latin America by providing free capacity building and training to use simple GIS tools for soil and water management in agriculture. The second category of applications that we observed is inferential applications, where GIS techniques are employed to identify and study statistical correlations between georeferenced variables. Within these applications, GIS are used to link data at different analytical levels, from using secondary or primary georeference data from different data sources. Additionally, through geostatistics, spatial analysis, and locational analysis, GIS are used in combination with econometric techniques to infer and visualize statistical relations and spatial patterns between data. For instance, in a study by the World Bank Development Research Group, GIS were used to link household and plot level data to provide a nationally representative analysis of the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Malawi. The final category of applications that we have observed is predictive applications. Here, GIS tools and techniques are employed to develop integrated assessment models where multiple databases are integrated to study the complex interactions between human systems and the environment. And additionally, GIS are used to estimate the value of unknown variables based on the spatial relations among known data points through interpolation. This last set of applications are particularly useful for research on gender and agri-food systems, insofar as they enable evaluating the expected impact of different policy interventions on women's empowerment and on different intersecting gender inequalities. And I will pass it to my colleague, Ariel, to provide an introduction to the different themes that we observed.
Thank you so much, Martina. And so moving quickly into the next aspect of our key findings, there were a number of recurrent themes that we had noticed throughout our research of where there was the nexus of geospatial applications within gendered and agri-food, within the gender and agri-food context. The first theme that we identified was gendered perceptions influencing agriculture and climate mitigation adaptations. So looking at how research looked at the different activities that men and women were conducting within the agricultural food system. And the first sub-theme under this was understanding the difference in agricultural production between men and women. And so the best example that we found is with a study from Virginia Tech that looked at the gender dimension in conservation agriculture, and more specifically of the soil quality in the Philippines, where researchers looked to understand the perceptions of the best and worst soils for agricultural production within households. And they found that men and women within the same household generally chose the same best soils, but had different perception of worse soils on their farms, which led researchers into a broader discussion on conservation agriculture and the gendered practices within the space, particularly in this specific context, as well as access to resources and how those all influence men and women's soil knowledge. And that also leads into the capacity building for women farmers. So as Martina discussed, with the Women's Geospatial Technologies Rally, the interview that we had that really focused on building the capacity for women to be able to use these technologies for soil monitoring, crop monitoring within their own agricultural settings, and particularly to mitigate or predict events of extreme climate patterns that will affect their own production. The final area within this sub-theme was influencing policy decisions and planning with gender perspective. So GIS and geospatial approaches were used to identify where areas of interventions are needed, and particularly this can be from looking at cross-sectional survey data and overlaying it with maps to understand where there was a need of food insecurity, and that is an example from rural areas in Iran, and where they needed to target interventions to mitigate that food insecurity. Then the second theme was gendered impacts within socioeconomic development, and the two sub-themes under here were mapping inequalities and highlighting the need and impacts of infrastructure development, so looking at access to roads and transportation systems, which then affect the access to markets for women farmers to sell their outputs. And here with mapping inequalities, a lot of it was be able to use mapping access to different resources, such as water or technology, such as another interview that we did was the Cadasta Foundation, and they found that gender involvement in collecting primary data was unequal, particularly because women lacked the access to mobile GIS and the education around that. And so that's an area where they targeted their interventions. As well, under this theme, a lot of studies mapped and looked at land ownership and tenure arrangements as well. The final theme that we had was gender roles and division of labor in agri-food systems. And while this theme falls under the other two themes, we did bring it out because many of the studies through geospatial approaches were able to identify where women and men's roles very much differed within the agri-food production system, especially within smaller communities. And we thought that was a very interesting one to highlight as well. And so with the thematic analysis, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Siwei to talk about challenge, gaps, and opportunities.
Thank you, Ariel. So beginning with the challenges, on the next slide, please. Beginning with the challenges, data availability appeared to be the most common challenge. In particular, gender-specific data needed for GIS is limited, particularly in rural, local, and Indigenous contexts, where the nuanced realities of women's roles in agriculture are often underrepresented. While census data might provide broader indicators such as literacy rates or sex ratios, it can lack the granularity needed to model gender-sensitive agri-food systems effectively. Additionally, securing funding for gender disaggregated data collection early in the process is often a barrier, as research priorities are frequently shaped by donor interests. Research agendas can also be shaped in this way, leading to narrower studies focused on more specific aspects of agriculture rather than on agri-food systems as a whole. In addition to availability, the challenge of data reliability was also highlighted as a concern due to the variation in quality and consistency of GIS and socioeconomic data collection. This can differ across between countries and regions, which lead to discrepancies that hinder reliable analysis across cases. The last challenge I wanted to highlight was the issue of data ethics and privacy, and the integration of GIS with participant-specific data raises concerns about confidentiality and data protection. For instance, anonymization methods such as randomizing participant locations can limit the depth of analysis, and this was seen in a study examining women's access to infrastructure, where a point-to-point analysis was needed, but to protect participants' identities, their locations were randomized within a 1.1 to 2 kilometer radius. In sensitive contexts, GIS mapping risks exposing vulnerable communities to unintended harm, particularly where social tensions are high. And moving on to the next slide, please. With the gaps, the scoping review highlighted several gaps in knowledge, methodology, and data. In terms of knowledge, technical expertise in GIS remains a barrier. While some tools are highly specialized, the perception that GIS is overly complex can discourage wider adoption beyond research teams and uptake for non-specialists. From a methodological perspective, GIS techniques are not typically uniformly applied across disciplines, and there's also a need for more sort of innovation around this to address the challenges of representing gendered experiences and social constructs within GIS sort of frameworks. And finally, significant data gaps persist. Traditional data systems are unable to capture the spatial and gender-specific dimensions that are necessary for GIS analysis, such as women's division of labor and workloads. For example, socioeconomic data is often aggregated at administrative levels, which can lose the spatial variability needed to examine inequalities. Additionally, certain thematic areas like fisheries are underexplored due to the complexity of applying GIS in marine environments. And moving to the opportunities, addressing the knowledge gap, for instance, can be a way to demystify GIS tools and encourage wider adoption. Simplifying technical processes and providing training tailored to non-specialists could make GIS more accessible, enabling its integration into projects that would benefit even from basic applications. This democratization of GIS knowledge could also empower a broader range of stakeholders, including policymakers, researchers, and community organizations. And based on our research, the challenge with data availability can sort of depend on the research scope. And in some instances, a proxy could be substituted through open source data like the Living Standards Measurement Study from the World Bank or the Demographic and Health Survey. On the methodological front, there is a potential to sort of expand GIS techniques to better represent gendered experiences and social constructs. PGIS approaches, for example, could be more systematically applied in gender-focused studies to more directly involve women and marginalized communities in data collection and analysis. However, there is sort of a question to the extent to which spatially observable data can tell us about the subjective components of women's lived experiences that are reflective of their local realities and interventions that actually address the root causes of inequities and how this can actually contribute towards women's empowerment. This indicates a need to integrate qualitative data such as ethnographic data like storytelling or photographs into GIS frameworks that could bridge the gap between spatial and social analysis that could foster a stronger understanding of gender dynamics in agri-food systems. I'll now pass to Ariel to talk about our key learnings and recommendations.
Thank you. So just to wrap up of the research and our key findings, we have 3 key areas of learning, the first of which the GIS enables a deeper understanding of gender roles in agri-food systems, the necessity to use a multi-methodological approach within GIS to enhance data collection and fill data gaps that exist with the gender research field, that gender and feminist focus within research is a key opportunity to understand this context, and that there also needs to be a focus, particularly with data privacy, accessibility and availability, as these are one of the most frequent challenges, as Siwei discussed, for the use of GIS. These are the recommendations that we've developed based on the desk research, but also the interview with our partners, and we found 3 key areas for these recommendations. One is within agri-food research. And the first is to ensure that there's a gender lens throughout the entire geospatial research process. This is a key insight that was brought up in our interview with the Youth Mappers organization, who reflected how paramount it was to include women within data collection and within all phases of the agri-food research, especially rural settings, because this will avoid the reinforcing cycle of marginalization and the power asymmetries that we find may exist within the research, and as we've seen with the lack of gender disaggregated data. The second is leveraging participatory GIS methods, as Siwei also discussed, and then also improving technology accessibility. This is particularly important, as I know we didn't touch completely upon it, but the power dynamics is a particular challenge within this context between the researcher and the community where research is being done in. And so ensuring that the community and the women that are involved have access to the technology, that understand the language and of geospatial and the purpose of the research, and then are able to then take these knowledges and apply it for after. And so having that capacity building for the long-term impacts. Then the fourth part of this aspect is broadening research to include other food systems. So Siwei had talked about more aquaculture, but also including more livestock and pastoralism, because those are, as you probably heard, a lot of the findings that we had dealt with more agricultural production. In terms of the other area of developing collaborations, one of the main things that we want to highlight here is that many of the projects and the research studies focus primarily on women between the ages of 18 to 64 years old, so women within the households. But what came out in the interviews and also in a very small number of the studies is the need to have that intergenerational knowledge exchange, and also to ensure that youth and older women are involved within the research scope or within the projects, and making sure that collaboration is there. The last aspect are resources that we identified as needed based on the interviewee insights, as well as the research too. And so that can range from the fact that this is a very more niche area, but a growing area, and that the awareness of other knowledge and projects that are existing with using geospatial applications isn't as widely known, and creating a database that consolidates all of this. The second aspect within the recommendations is the translating knowledge to make it more accessible, not just for policymakers to make informed decisions, but also community members and other actors within the ecosystem. And with this, I will move into the panelist discussion, because I think this will bring a lot more of what we've been saying to life, as a lot of our findings have been validated by the interviewees. And so to start, I will start by introducing our first panel, which is with 2 members from Vizzuality. And Vizzuality is a private company that uses data-driven strategies and digital tools to help governments, businesses, and NGOs advance sustainability. They create customized, open source, and user-focused data solutions and tools to help people see the real picture of climate change and inequality. And with us today is Susana Romero, who works within the project portfolio and partnerships team. and Francis Gasser, who works within the Strategy and Impact team. And they will share just a little bit about their work and what they're doing. And yeah, so I don't know if Francis and Susanna, if you want to take the next 5 minutes to share.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ariel. So yeah, as Ariel said, I'm Francis Gassard. I work on strategy and impact at Vizzuality. So I'm a data scientist by training. I spend quite a bit of time with geospatial data, but really what I try to focus on is how do we design products that actually create the change we want to see in the world. And so at Vizzuality, we're this mission-driven design and technology firm focused on climate, nature, and social inequalities. And we primarily support organizations by building data visualization websites. And by making nice maps and helping to digest data in a way that can get people to use it and communicate it. But of course, as you're familiar with this sector, is that most of the data is on sort of the land and environment. Most of the geospatial data is on the land and environment side, which means that a lot of the work that we do tends to be on the land and environment side rather on the social issues. In terms of the work that we're doing that's most relevant to the discussion today, I think we can draw a lot of parallels between what we're doing in the nature space as well as what we're doing in the agricultural space with the topic of the study. So I think first thing is sort of one of the primary challenges of gender data, of social data in general, is that you can't see it directly from space. And there's sort of three sources of data for GIS. One is you use satellite, you see it directly from space. This is where we get the most of our data. Most of that is like, okay, if you can see it, you can start to model it and map it. That's great because it's global. It's able to be responsive and monitored. The second source is census, survey-based data, right? And the challenge with survey-based data is that it takes a lot of energy and effort to collect. It only happens once in a while, and maybe the people that designed the survey didn't design it in the way to collect the variables that you care about, or to collect them in a geospatially meaningful way that's representative of what you care about. Then the third source of data is sort of is crowdsourced data. So this might either be things that come from crowdsourcing applications. There's a very famous one in the nature space called iNaturalist, where you can take a photo of whatever species, whatever plant, animal, bug you see, and it will identify it, and then it goes into the system where other volunteers will verify that identification, and it goes up into this big database. And the sort of wonderful thing about something like this is that they can then model where these species are occurring, and they can model the certainty. When you start to model the certainty, you can also target where is it most valuable for us to collect more data, to go and collect more ground data. And the other one, of course, is OpenStreetMap, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it's really a very strong basis of all of the data that's out there, and that's crowdsourced, right? That's lots of volunteers and other organizations. The second thing I wanted to talk about was we have a specific program working with support, it's a business, working to support large agri-food companies in measuring impacts in their supply chains. And one of the challenges there is that you can't, it's really hard for them to track the things that they're buying all the way back to the source. And so there's techniques that you can use to sort of look at geospatial data, to look at these national level statistics, to look at trade and things like that, in order to try to get a best estimate of what's possible. And hopefully, if you can track things down, then you can look at the exact farm location. You can go and talk to the farmer. But if you can't, then you can still get a sort of estimate of what's possible. So I've talked for too long. I should let Susanna introduce herself. And yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, sorry, we are sharing the same booth and we didn't want to have like any problems. So hi, I'm Susanna. So differently from Francis, I'm not a data scientist. So my perspective is a bit more high level But the findings, the preliminary findings that you presented here resonate a lot with us, right? We do have the same issues in many of, even the climate sector, where you would say there's a lot of information, a lot of CO2 information, right? So all of emissions and etc. For example, biodiversity has a little bit less data. So something would be kind of similar to gender disaggregated data can be. But what I would like to bring to the discussion is probably the fact that data has these three components, right? It has to exist. That's what we were saying. It has to be accessible so that people can use it in different ways, and it has to be used. And this last part is very important. But actually, data should become secondary, so we shouldn't be focusing so much on that, because what the primary goal is to answer to a problem. So the solution and the impact should be always our primary goal, right? Sometimes we focus too much on the data and we lose sight of what we were doing in the first place. In the first place, we were trying to solve a problem. So in that sense, what we do and this type of solution sometimes we construct is based on case studies. So instead of trying to be very megalomanous and go for this global data sets, and we work with a lot of global data sets, but sometimes it's more useful to go on small local case studies and focus on that, see the impact, and then see if that can extrapolate to other things or not. Because specifically in gender inequality, I mean, this is so much tied to cultural issues and to contextual issues that it's hard to try to standardize this or globalize it in a certain way. So we also see that, and what we do is we construct a lot of what we call storytellings, where you, through data, through use cases, examples, you can do this advocacy, but also help the policymakers understand, okay, this was the case in this context. What can I take from this context to my own context? So thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, and I'm really excited for you guys to be here, because you offer the private sector perspective that is something that we feel that isn't necessarily always included within these types of research. So excited for everyone to be able to ask questions after. And now moving into our next panel is with AidData. Sorry, I think there may be. So our next panel is with Catherine Nolan, Jessica Wells, and Rachel Sayers from AidData. And AidData is an international development research lab that touches upon e-transparency, information technology, and geocoding based at the William & Mary University in the United States. Jessica, Catherine, and Rachel are all research scientists within AidData's Research and Evaluation Unit, and all are also co-creators for AidData's new Gender Equity and Development Initiative, which focuses on bringing AidData's geospatial and research expertise to the gender space. So very excited to have them here with us, and also share their perspective from the Research Institute side, and to hear more about their Gender Equity and Development Initiative. And I'm not sure if I should hand it over to Catherine first.
Actually, you can hand it over to me. This is Jessica Wells.
Perfect. To you then.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. As I stated, my name is Jessica Wells, and I'm a research scientist at AidData. And coming from a different perspective, rather than from the private sector, coming from academia and from research, here to talk a little bit about our Gender Equity and Development Initiative and how we utilize GIS data within that. So one of our big portfolios within AidData is actually conducting evaluations, and in particular conducting retrospective evaluations, and how we can utilize then GIS data. And so along this way of using GIS data in retrospective evaluations, we noticed that there is a real opportunity to be able to use GIS data, especially to study issues around women, looking at disaggregated outcomes for sure, but also looking at how do we measure women's empowerment.
So in contexts where measuring women's empowerment with traditional surveys might either be too difficult in certain contexts or might be prohibitively expensive, are there ways that we can actually complement traditional survey-based approaches with GIS data to measure women's empowerment? So this is one of the areas that we are interested in growing and learning how we can complement this type of research. Right. And I think we have a couple of projects that kind of highlight how we've used it, and happy to talk a little bit more about this in our Q&A as well. So the first is, as was mentioned, we often use these large agricultural surveys like the LSMS, where we can gather a lot of really important information, right? And one thing we find is that in these large agricultural surveys, we often interview one member of the household. We often ask for the most knowledgeable member of the household. And I see some shaking heads here, where often this is the male who answers these surveys, right? And what do we learn when we are only utilizing one survey respondent, in particular a male? So we wanted to study this further by going to northern Ghana, where we could actually survey couples. We interviewed men and women, so a man and a wife, that made agricultural decisions on a plot within their household. We asked them the same set of interview questions. We asked them separately, but we asked the same interview question guide to compare their answers. And from the literature, we know that couples often strongly disagree within answering these types of surveys. For instance, in one study in Mexico, 24% of couples, when surveyed, couldn't agree whether there was a refrigerator in their household, right? And so we wanted to investigate this further. However, we wanted to take this further than just acknowledging that there's disagreement between couples. What we wanted to do is look for actual bias. And in order to analyze bias, you need a third independent observation for which you can compare the two survey responses against. So in this particular case, we used GIS data. We were able to take plot boundary walks for each of the plots that each member of the couple identified as being within their household. We expected that there would be disagreement, but we were surprised that there was disagreement on the number of plots that were owned by the household for which agriculture activities were taking place. And then in addition, we were also able to measure bias, and we found that there is significant bias. We found that men were over-reporting the number of plots. We're finding that they're reporting shorter distances from their household to their plot. And we were also finding that using remotely sensed data and satellite imagery, we were looking and creating a measure of fallowness. And we found that men were reporting harvest on crops on fields for which we found to be fallow. And so understanding kind of the setting for which we use these large agricultural surveys and how there might be inherent bias within them leads us at AidData to want to investigate this further, hopefully to help provide solutions to these challenges and increasingly bring awareness to how GIS data can come forward and help play a pivotal role in analyzing these pieces as well, because we want to make sure that when we are producing this type of data, it's being used to its greatest effect. Right. And so another example of how we use GIS is we're also working right now on a retrospective evaluation in Nepal. And we're looking at the impacts of a farming app that was specifically targeted at women in particular. But given budget constraints, instead of conducting a traditional survey, we are instead utilizing self-collected field GPS plot points that was part of the app when the users signed up to help us remotely measure yields over time on those plots for high intensity and low intensity app users. So trying to understand the differences in these yields between these two different groups that was specifically targeting women. And so for this, we're looking at this from 2021 up until now and looking to identify these differences. But overall, I think this is how we can show and highlight the value that GIS data can bring to the table, whether it's used to help us look at these issues of bias in agricultural surveys and to improve upon measurement, or if it's looking to do this retrospective kind of evaluation, where an evaluation may not have been planned for at the beginning, but certainly would be useful, right? And at the end of a program, if there is a desire to look at these type of questions, then we can add GIS to it. And one of the most powerful things I think that GIS data brings to the table is we can use it to complement traditional evaluation approaches. So where we do collect household survey data, that answers a certain set of research questions, which is really great. But bringing GIS data on board and alongside this set of data opens up a wider field of questions that we can then answer and bring these two types of data sources together to provide a more holistic approach to the evaluation questions. And especially, where women might be more difficult to survey, or in contexts where it doesn't make sense to go and collect that type of traditional household survey data, we can add GIS data. Maybe we answer slightly different questions, but this helps us get at questions that might be important for women especially. And so at AidData, this is where we are trying to push the frontiers and the boundary of GIS research. So thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I am just going to add Francis and Susanna, and I know Francis will have to leave us in shortly soon for another panel, but I want to welcome the audience to ask any questions within the chat or raise your hand as well. But just to start off, because I think something that both of you talked about was the use of self-collection and the use of applications, and I'm guessing this may be with mobile data. And so I'm wondering, in your experiences, because we're talking more in the rural context, how do you overcome areas where there's a lack of connectivity, or ensuring that people have access to mobile GIS, as that's something that we found in one of our interviews where women had that lack of access and lack of usage?
I'm not sure who starts, but I can help kick us off, and we can turn it to our other panelists for their insights as well. This issue of connectivity and being able to provide kind of this GPS data, I think, is one that's relevant. In our particular case, as we do evaluation, sometimes we run into this as we are using enumerators to go and collect either field data itself, whether these are boundaries of plots or whatnot. And so this requires, in some contexts, extensive testing to making sure that GPS loggers can actually collect the points and the places we think that they will be. And so ensuring that we pilot thoroughly in order to verify that this is happening where it should. We've run into those challenges before, where some GPS loggers, for some reason, are not picking up data correctly. But also in this case of this evaluation we're working on, right? This is having women who already have access to these apps that can then collect the data. So I think we're in a different position, but I'm sure Francis and others can talk about where they see these challenges as well.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a challenge. I mean, I think this broad recognition that mobile connectivity is getting much better very, very quickly in most of the world, but there are still going to be places everywhere, even in Western developed nations, that don't have mobile connectivity, right? And so any sort of survey collection system it's work, but it's a technical challenge that can be solved. Needs to be able to work offline and then synchronize to get the data back online, right? I think the second challenge that we need to be aware of when we're relying on crowdsourced data or like survey participants to submit data themselves is that it's often just as you were describing, Jessica, that when we ask for survey participants, it's often the head of household, right? The man that is going to be responding. It's often the head of household, the man that owns the phone, if the family has one phone, and they're the ones who are going to be using the phone and controlling access to the phone. And so we have to have that same sort of awareness of if there's biases in our data collection methods when thinking about this.
Great, thank you so much. And we have a question in the chat, and it's, as a researcher in an extremely rural village with women farmers, as this person's working on potential of ICT to improve women farmers' information and accessing mechanisms, what are their key points to be taken care of if they want to incorporate GIS into their studies?
All right, happy to take that one as well. I think that's a really great question. You know, when we're working in these types of contexts, I think one of the most important pieces is that we try to incorporate it early, right? If this is part of primary data collection, you want to try and include that as early within your study as possible and to plan for it. You know, at AidData, we do try to do this retrospectively in many cases where it wasn't planned for, but that's rather difficult. So my suggestion is to try to identify ways in which GIS data complement the type of research questions that are being asked, and then to think critically about how you can collect that up front. What would it take to be able to do that? And then because this is also in a rural village and you're working with women farmers, you know, how can you incorporate these women into the data collection process? Is it that these women help lead you to the fields where you are collecting some of this GIS data that, you know, it can help collect good data? Is it that we also use female enumerators to help collect this data as well? So I would suggest thinking about this early at the beginning in the design phase, and then thinking through what it would take to collect meaningful data.
Yeah, I agree. So many times we have to think about the digital literacy of the people who will be involved in the study. That's very important. What Jessica just mentioned. So having some kind of broker in between the people who are being surveyed, for example, and the data platform that we are serving, right? So having someone who's trained specifically to collect that data, so it's easier to have quality data and avoid, because if you put the weight into, for example, this women farmers, it wouldn't be fair, right? A lot of resources are not available. It's very difficult to get quality data. So that's key.
And maybe just add one last thing. I would say that I like to say that actually most of the data that we work with is by definition wrong. It's sort of top down, like it's useful primarily before the study in deciding where to have your study and where to do your research and doing that first bit of prioritization. But then you're going to sort of get much better information on the ground than the GIS data can ever teach you. And maybe there's a little bit of a feedback loop there, but you really have to design a study specifically if you want to create a feedback loop versus if you're seeking to answer a specific question.
Could I add a point that's come up through our research is also the issue of capacity building. And that actually, I think, comes both, like Jessica was saying, the importance at the beginning, especially if women are to be the enumerators or kind of the data collectors in some sense, but also thinking of capacity building at the end of a GIS project, and how even if thinking of opportunities, or even where there might be GIS data that's not necessarily gender specific. So for example, information on crop yields, on markets, on early warning systems, if we're looking at climate change, how development interventions can use capacity building with female farmers or different groups so that they can best use that information and, you know, have access to that technology. So I guess that is another dimension around connectivity.
Great, thank you so much. I want to ask if there's other questions from the audience. No worries, Francis. Thank you so much for joining. I think I want to ask, thank you so much. Have a good day. And then I want to ask a question regarding power dynamics, because I think this is really important within this context of power dynamics between, you know, researcher and the community, but also, as you said, men are often going to be the ones that may have the mobile connectivity or the mobile phone or the one that we access to. And so I'm wondering how in your separate projects or fields that you navigate these power dynamics. So, Catherine, I'm not sure if you, or Jessica, if you want to start.
Absolutely. So, you know, I think this kind of highlights within our first study, right, this question of if you interview different members of the household, you will get different answers. And so part of what we are trying to do is uncover what this looks like. And so in our particular study, and we specifically were trying to target both men and women to highlight some of this difference and to make that part of our study. Sometimes that's not feasible, but we hope that there's kind of a growing desire to add that within other research contexts. But also GIS helps us look at outcomes in places that are hard to reach. So maybe there are these power dynamics and maybe it is difficult to do a traditional survey. We can use GIS data to help answer research questions that maybe help remove some of those power dynamics a little bit. And so right now we're trying to understand how we can use GIS data to look at outcomes for women to help us overcome these same challenges, right? And so hopefully GIS will help us kind of get around some of these issues. So where they do exist, what correlates with women's empowerment? What do we see in satellite imagery that might correlate with women's empowerment when we can't survey them directly, right? These are key questions that we want to answer and where we want to push GIS research into the next frontier.
Yeah, and maybe going on a tangent here, but I think it's important when we're talking about power dynamics or power imbalance, specifically in the food agricultural sector. The conversation around how we finance these things. So a lot of things is about risk. So there's insurance companies that are interested in the data, in the field, in the sector, and also banks, of course, who finance the farmers. So as you know, women have less access to these credits and these lines of credit. So already the power is in balance, I don't know, 20-fold or more, starting with how can you finance your business? So for the women who are small farm holders and etc. So I think that if you look into this in a really truly collaborative perspective, for example, credits could be not only, the money side, which is absolutely important, but could also have this perspective of financing the GIS research and giving more access to resources and data information to these more vulnerable communities. So there's a lot that can be done, and bringing to the table this big corporates, the insurance companies, the banks, and a lot of banks are actually doing a great job already thinking about all these dimensions. It's just that we don't know about it so much, right? In the Netherlands, Rabobank is, for example, a pioneer in agricultural impact. So I think it's really important to have the corporate world also helping and supporting these topics, specifically because they are also many times the drivers for this power imbalance.
Thank you so much, both. And I think you very much touched upon the question that's appeared from Elizabeth Akini and from the Agricultural Finance Corporation in Kenya. And they've asked, how can integrating geospatial approaches into gender analysis enhance the development of tailored products for agricultural lending, particularly in addressing the unique needs of diverse farmer segments? And I think that this may be our last question. So if you guys want to answer, and then if anyone else has any other questions, please do put them in the chat and we can try and field them as well. But yeah, anyone wants to answer first between Jessica and Susanna?
Sure, happy to add my thoughts to this question. I think this is a good one. It's tough. I think that GIS data has the ability to help us learn more about women farmers in particular. I think, one of the things we saw in our study in Ghana is that the plots that were often overlooked were women's household gardens that they were growing themselves, right? This might be information that as agricultural products are tailored to women in particular, is understanding what their farming practices are like. How do they differ from men? What are their needs, and how are their needs as farmers different than their male counterpart farmers? And so I think using GIS data can help us uncover these differences and then can lead to better agricultural products that are targeted to women specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this always needs to be it needs to be an holistic approach all the time. So GIS will provide some context, it will help, but this is not a silver bullet, right? We don't have a one size fits all. GIS will not save us all from, unfortunately, from the climate crisis. You do need to look at it always from the holistic point of view. The same with AI discussions, right? We have more and more AI discussions around climate, environment, biodiversity, and even social sciences. And this is, I don't know if you saw that there's a curve about adoption of a new technology or innovation. So there's a lot of hype in the beginning. So a lot of everybody talking about it, a lot of research, and then goes down deeply, and then it just stabilizes. So I guess GIS and gender research is still not even on that hype curve, right? So somehow it has been underutilized. But like Jessica said, it can definitely be utilized to get to that impact we want to have. We shouldn't trust it has the answer for all our problems. It will not solve the data gap, for example, right? It will just tangentially in a tangent way solve that, but it will not solve all. So it's very important to also have collaborations. Again, for me, the collaborations are key because we cannot all be experts of everything. That's impossible. So we should, partner up with people who know a lot, like really smart people that do a lot of, the research and that do a lot of the GIS, that do a lot of the social sciences, and put those people together solving the same problem. And usually that makes us go further.
I just wanted to comment on that as well, because I think that's definitely a really good point. I think GIS is one data source in a constellation of many types of data sources that can be triangulated to help answer a lot of these questions. And so I think the point is very valid that GIS by itself might not answer all of these questions, but it's really, I think, the harmonizing of all these data sources together to provide that holistic approach and answer. And I think that is where we do see the need to be able to bring people from various backgrounds together who have these complementary skills in order to answer these questions well. So that's a great question that was asked.
Thank you so much. And I do see, just to say that the recordings and materials will be shared with all the participants. And there is one last question if you guys have time to stay on to answer it. I know that we're just about at time, but it is about GIS data, including young people in agriculture. And if the person has commented that it's important as to include young people in agriculture, as there has been a focus on dignified jobs for the youth and the need for disaggregate data for youth in agriculture, and was wondering if you guys have any learnings or thoughts in terms of this topic.
I think this is also another really great question about how do we ensure that we have GIS data that can help us look holistically at the entire population within agriculture. And in our particular work at AidData, right now we have focused more on adults and adults in the agricultural system. However, surveys can be designed to help us analyze what is happening with the trends with youth in agriculture. And I think in the same way, GIS may be helpful. I don't think I am in the best position to answer how we have done that, but I think that there is growing room to be able to look at these questions.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert at all, so I'll not pretend to be. The only comment that I think, to me at least, is the fact that globally, young people, they're more and more prone to be more tech savvy, right? So this allows us perhaps to have more grassroots organizations, or maybe more of this citizen science coming from youth groups, right? And so they can also be a tremendous important source of information and should not be disregarded. Of course, the question is, how do we look for them, and how do we know they exist, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people are doing great jobs, but again, I'm not an expert, so I couldn't say, but I would think that youth is much more prone to start developing this web applications and technology and using it. So yeah, definitely important to survey them as well.
And I just want to add, before we close out, and I hand it over to Ranjita from CGIAR to close out the webinar, that also in our research, so we had interviewed women, someone from Women Geotechnologies Rally, and we also interviewed someone from Youth Mappers. And Youth Mappers is an organization where students across the world are trained to use GIS, collect geospatial data, and encourage them to also pursue their own projects with using open street maps, which is an organization that I know Francis mentioned, as well as in the other project that they also are training young women. And I think this is really important, as it's important to ensure that there's more women within these programs, and that they do have they have the goal of ensuring that within the agricultural production that they are understanding how youth are being involved in GIS, and ensuring that they're increasing their capacity and then being able to bring that forward within their careers. And that's something that we saw within those 2 interviews. And I can also do links to those 2 organizations when we share the materials. But I wanted to mention that because there are those 2 projects that are focusing also within young women. But it is an interesting topic as well to discuss, and it's why we've included it as one of the recommendations, to make sure that there is that focus within youth within this context. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to Jessica Wells and Sara Romero from Vizzuality and Jessica from AidData, so much for your time, for your participation in the research. And we are very excited to have had you here today, and for your comments and for this discussion. It was incredibly interesting. And with that, knowing that we're a bit over time, I'm going to hand it over to Ranjita, who will be closing up this webinar. And before I do, I also want to say, please, we won't close out the Padlet yet. If you have any feedback from the webinar or on the research, please feel free to go into that link that's in the chat after the webinar is closed to add in your comments and feedbacks. Yes, Ranjita, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Ari. I'm Ranjita. I lead the evidence module for the CGIAR-GENDER platform. First of all, thank you to the Shared Planet team for a fantastic study, and also organizing this webinar and pulling in Jessica, Sue, and Francis into this conversation. That was excellent, excellent, excellent. Lots to take away from there. I mean, we've run out of time, so I'll have to keep this really short, but very excited about this. I mean, geospatial analysis, one of the most rapidly developing research areas, I think. But then if you look at it, we found 75 studies. So is that a lot? Is that more than what I expected? Or if you look at like years of research and we only just have 75, is that good enough? So clearly, as Sue said, I think it's probably been the whole gender, the intersection, the research at that intersection has probably not been utilized fully. So maybe a lot of work to do. And also, as you all highlighted, it's been restricted to very few themes, a lot on the crops, but not on livestock, aquaculture, etc., which is actually very important for women farmers. So something to think about, I guess. And that is possibly also because of these, gender gaps gender data gaps that have been very persistent. And one of the things, Jessica, as you mentioned, we were looking for evidence on what works to advance gender equality in agri-food systems. Very few evaluations there. So if, geospatial analysis can help us fill some of those gaps, bring together the traditional methods and this, I think that would be a very, very powerful tool. And as the study has demonstrated, and as some of you have mentioned, can be a very powerful tool again for participatory action research, research for development, the whole monitoring, how do we make it, efficient and be able to triangulate, etc. something that I think we should be, looking deeply into, but also being very conscious about the power dynamics and the ethical issues that come into play. What's clear is that this is not, Sue, thank you for those very wise words. I'm taking away a lot of those. This is not an answer to all our questions. This is not the panacea, one size doesn't fit all. It needs to be in combination with other methods and disciplines. And that's where I think these whole collaborations and stuff come in. And then I think we have been sort of talking, this whole study surfaced some very interesting applications, examples of applications. So how do we pursue some of these? How do we deepen and expand some of these? How can we ask questions we haven't been able to answer? Could these methods help us answer some of these questions? I think lots there. And we've talked about policy influence. A lot of this stuff is very context specific. And is it enough to advocate or influence or lobby for policy changes? We are all these days very obsessed with scaling and, how do we identify and scale solutions that work? Is this a method that would help us do some of that? But while being very cautious, as Sue said, case studies are really important. Don't just go big and do something which might not be applicable or effective everywhere. And also that data should not become the end in itself, but a means to an end. Look for solutions. So Sue, you can see I'm taking away a lot of this stuff with me. Thanks for that reality check for us. So I guess, I could just go on, but I think stop there on the note that collaborations are important. Thank you, Shared Planet, for helping us, sort of get started in that, on that direction, in that path. And I'd like to think this is the first step, and we'd be able to grow this work together with all of you and more. Somebody I think you mentioned, should we have a network, a platform, or a community of practice? Oftentimes, more communities of practice fall apart fairly quickly because they are fairly intensive, time and facilitation intensive. But I think if there are enough committed people, we could pull this off. So let's continue this conversation and then see if we could sort of push the boundaries in this area and answer some questions we haven't been able to answer in a more efficient and effective manner. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Bye.
Bye.